Hello, today a new story for you. Enjoy. In a rich suburb, St. Helena's General Hospital was known for its excellent medical care. But it was about to face an unexpected problem. When skilled black nurse Andrea Davis joined the team, she had no idea that she would have to deal with deep-seated racism. As things got worse, Ruth Thompson, a patient who didn't seem special, watched quietly from her hospital bed. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't like any other patient. Her arrival would soon change everything. What kind of hidden power did this mysterious woman have? And how could the battle of one nurse lead to changes in the institution? Under the bright fluorescent lights, Andrea Davis walked into St. Helena's General for the first time. The rooms were shiny and clean. An unpleasant smell of cleaning filled the air, and there was a tension that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Andrea stood up straight, even though she was worried. She was determined to make a good impression. There was a strange quiet in the area as she got closer to the nurse's station. People stopped talking and started whispering. They also looked away. Even though she felt alone, Andrea asked quietly, "Excuse me, I'm Andrea Davis, the new nurse. Could you show me the way to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse looked up, and her blue eyes got a little bigger before she smiled. "Of course," she replied. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Andrea agreed and walked down the hall, knowing that eyes were following her every move. Even though it was very quiet, the clicking of her shoes could be heard elsewhere. Before she got to the office, a tall, well-dressed man in a white coat came out of a closed room. With his salt and pepper hair and strong build, he stood out as a senior doctor. Andrea's heart beat faster. This might be her chance to connect with someone in a good way. "Good morning, doctor," Andrea said to him. "I'm Andrea Davis, the new nurse starting today." "It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor looked at her for a moment with cold, gray eyes. "Dr. Eric Fraser," was his short answer. "I trust you know our rules," Dr. Fraser said, and before Andrea could answer, he added, "We have very high standards here at St. Helena's. I hope you're ready to meet them." He didn't wait for an answer, then walked past her, leaving her standing in the hallway with her hand outstretched. Even though the experience was disappointing, Andrea decided to keep a positive attitude. She took a deep breath, sat up straight, and knocked on the door of the head nurse. She thought about what her mother had said while she waited. When she was younger, her mother told her, "Baby girl, you're going to have to fight twice as hard as everyone else, but don't let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and that strength runs through you." Andrea remembered how she had to study late at night, work extra hours in the lab, and always feel like she had to prove herself. She remembered how professors would dismiss her in a subtle way and raise an eyebrow when she did well on a test. She was ready for the fight now that she was in St. Helena's General Hospital. She wondered if she really belonged, because her peers talked behind her back and gave her sideways looks. Still, she didn't give up. She graduated at the top of her class, and even the harshest judges couldn't stop her. As she stood in the halls of St. Helena's, those memories gave her strength. She had been through tough times before, and would do so again. When the door opened, a middle-aged woman with a serious look came in. "I take it you're Miss Davis," she said it with a clipped tone. "Come in. We need to get through a lot, and I expect you to keep up." Andrea went with the head nurse. She was nervous because she thought this was more than just a new job. There was a tension in the hospital that was hidden by the professional looks and clean efficiency. She had no idea that her presence would soon bring to light the deep-seated biases that were hiding behind St. Helena's prestigious exterior. The rest of Andrea's first day was a blur of meetings, tasks, and briefings. As she moved around the hospital, she couldn't help but notice how conversations would start up again after she was out of hearing. They would start up again as whispered rumors. When she tried to make small talk, the people there were nice but distant, making her feel alone in a place that should have been a place where people worked together. Andrea was mentally and emotionally worn out by the end of the day. As she got her things out of her locker, she heard two nurses talking behind her back. Someone asked, "Did you see the new employee?" "Yeah," he said. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the place for someone like her." She felt her heart sink and her hand frozen. While she had hoped it was just the nerves of the first day, it now felt like something much deeper. It wasn't just a job. Every day they had to fight against bias and false beliefs. The day's events made her feel heavy as she left the hospital. She was alone and full of worry as she sat at the bus stop. She took out her phone and called a number she knew. After it rings, her mother's soft, soothing voice picked up. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Andrea tried hard not to cry. She said in a whisper, "Mama, it was hard." She waited a moment before her mother spoke again. Her voice was wise and strong. She told Andrea Marie Davis, "You've worked too hard to let anyone put you down. Don't forget where you came from or who you are. There's more than one little black girl who wants to walk those halls one day. You're not just there for yourself." Andrea thought about what her mother had said. "I know, Mama. It's just harder than I expected." She was told by her mother, "Nothing worth doing is ever easy. But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and don't you dare let them see you falter." Andrea said, "I hear you, Mama," and she became more determined. Andrea saw a sleek black Mercedes slow down as it went by after the call finished. She saw Dr. Fraser looking at her through the covered windows. They looked at each other for a split second before the car sped off. Andrea straightened her back as she thought about what her mother had said. She knew it was going to be hard, but she wasn't by herself. She was ready for any tasks St. Helena's would bring her, with the help of her family and her own determination. She had no idea that her coming would set off a chain of events that would shake the hospital to its core and force it to face long-hidden biases and harmful habits. The other staff were busy with their own jobs, but it was clear that they were listening in as Dr. Fraser walked away. Andrea could feel the opinions that were being held against her. During the day, she was always given the hardest and least desirable jobs, while her white co-workers worked on easier cases. "Andrea, could you please take Mr. Johnson to room 305? A nurse asked in a fake sweet voice. "She's been a little difficult today," Sarah said. She knew that difficult was not the right word. Mr. Johnson was known for going on racist rants, which made two nurses cry just that week. Andrea walked into the room ready for what was to come because she wanted to show how professional she was. "Ask yourself, why are you here?" He spit out Mr. Johnson. "I told them that no black nurse should touch me." Andrea took a deep breath to calm down. "Mr. Thompson, I'm here to change your clots and check your vital signs. I promise that I'm fully qualified." Andrea kept her cool while working, even though he was being called racial names all the time. She did her work carefully, not letting his hatred affect how much she cared. As soon as she came out, Dr. Fraser stood there waiting with a sad face. "Is everything okay, Nurse Davis? There was some noise, mister." "He is steady, and his dressing has been changed," Andrea told him, meeting his eyes. "Well," Dr. Fraser said with a smirk, "let's hope you can stay calm with all of your patients. We don't want any complaints, do we?" Andrea couldn't get rid of the feeling that she had been put through an unfair test that she never should have had to go through as he walked away. The rest of her shift was filled with a lot of chores and small annoyances. She checked her work twice, not because she didn't believe in herself, but because she knew that any mistake would be seen as huge. While she worked, her white co-workers laughed and talked their way through their jobs, not having to worry about anything. There was a clear difference, but Andrea couldn't speak up because of her mother's words. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." Andrea heard two nurses talking quietly nearby as her shift was ending. "Isn't it crazy how much they care about hiring people from different backgrounds?" said with a voice full of contempt. "They can't even keep up with the rest of us." Andrea hit her locker, and her hand frozen. Her heart was beating fast, and she wanted to face them. But she knew that doing that would make their biases stronger. Instead, she quietly locked her locker and walked out of the hospital with a strong head, even though the day had been hard. The sleek black Mercedes from before pulled up again at the bus stop. Dr. Fraser was seen behind the wheel when the window was rolled down. His voice was fake stressed as he called out, "Nurse Davis, are you still waiting for the bus? That's too bad, that's all you can buy on a nurse's pay, right?" Andrea was embarrassed and angry when he quickly drove off before she could answer. His casual rudeness hurt her deeply and made her remember how hard her fight was. Every day at St. Helena's, Andrea's mind was full of feelings as she got on the bus. The excitement and hope she felt when she first started felt like a faraway memory. In its place, she had a grim determination to stay alive in the dangerous environment. Even though she was having a hard time every day, there was a voice in her head telling her that something had to change. The question was whether the constant stress would finally break her or whether her determination would finally change the toxic culture at St. Helena's. Andrea had no idea that an unexpected friend would soon enter her life. This person would help her bring to light the deep-seated biases in the hospital. Andrea closed her eyes as the bus rumbled through the dark streets. She drew power from her mother's words and the strength that ran through her. There would be another fight tomorrow, but she was ready to go for it, no matter how hard it was. Andrea came to St. Helena's the next morning with even more drive. She was focused and determined as she thought about why she became a nurse in the first place, to help people from all walks of life. There was a lot going on at the nurse's station that caught her eye. "What's going on?" Andrea asked a co-worker who seemed a little too excited. "We've got a VIP patient coming in," her co-worker said, forgetting how cold they usually are toward Andrea. Some big thing with both arms broken from an ice skating accident. Andrea didn't have time to ask anything else before Dr. Fraser showed up, looking serious. "Nurse Davis, I need you to handle the new admission in room 412, Mrs. Ruth Thompson. Both arms are broken. Provide her with the utmost care and attention." Andrea agreed, knowing that this was another test. "Of course, Dr. Fraser, I'll see to it right away." Andrea got close to room 412 and had a strange feeling that this task was different. Because this case was so important, she wondered if there was more to it than met the eye. When she walked in, she saw a middle-aged woman in bed with casts on her arms. Even though she was hurt, she gave off a quiet dominance. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Andrea said with a smile. "I'm Nurse Andrea Davis, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay." Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes wide and ready to judge. She said, "Good morning, Nurse Davis," but her voice was stronger than I thought it would be. "Thank you for your help. I must say, I didn't expect to end up here after my accident." While Andrea checked her vital signs, she realized that Mrs. Thompson was closely watching her. She wasn't looking down at her like she often felt, but with thoughtful curiosity. "You seem very skilled, Nurse Davis," Mrs. Thompson said as I changed her infusion. "How long have you been working at St. Helena's?" Andrea stopped, shocked by how interested she really was. She slowly responded, "Just a few weeks, miss. It's been an experience." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow and laughed out loud. "I see," she replied. "And how do you find the hospital?" "Living up to its prestigious reputation, I hope." Before Andrea could answer, Dr. Fraser walked in, and he seemed incredibly happy. "Mrs. Thompson, I trust Nurse Davis. She is taking good care of you. We assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients," Dr. Fraser said in a smooth voice. Andrea kept a neutral face, even though she knew that Dr. Fraser had never been so sure of her skills before. But Mrs. Thompson seemed to notice the difference. "Indeed, Dr. Fraser," she said, looking back and forth between Andrea and the doctor. "Nurse Davis has been exceptional. I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Helena's." Dr. Fraser thought for a moment before coming back with a forced smile. "Well, I'm sure she'd tell you it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on maintaining an inclusive and supportive environment at St. Helena's." Even though Andrea was angry about the injustice, she kept her cool. But Mrs. Thompson could feel the strain beneath the surface. She thought for a moment, her eyes still on Andrea. "Is that true?" I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand. Andrea couldn't get rid of the thought that something important had just happened as Dr. Fraser talked about Mrs. Thompson's treatment plan. The way Mrs. Thompson looked at her and the questions she asked made it seem like she could see through St. Helena's smooth surface. Over the next few days, Andrea spent more time with Mrs. Thompson than with any other patient. Even though she was hurt, she was always alert and interested, and she asked her a lot about her work and past. She wasn't prejudiced like many other people at the hospital. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested. While Andrea was changing Mrs. Thompson bandages one afternoon, she heard a talk outside the room that made her heart race. A nurse growled, "I don't care what Dr. Fraser says. I don't trust that Davis woman with our VIP patient." "Who knows what she might do, I know," said another voice. "But we can't say anything, they'll just accuse us of being racist." Andrea's hands were shaking as she finished putting on the bandage because she was always being suspected. Mrs. Thompson saw that she was upset. She asked Nurse Davis in a soft, questioning voice, "Is everything okay?" Giving Mrs. Thompson a fake smile, Andrea said, "Of course, Mrs. Thompson, just focusing on getting these bandages perfect." She looked at her face for a short time. "You know," she whispered, "I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they perceive as beneath them." After hearing what she said, Andrea looked up. Mrs. Thompson looked her in the eyes and knew what she was thinking. "I've seen a lot, Nurse Davis, and from this bed, the view has been quite revealing." Dr. Fraser walked in and cut off their talk before Andrea could answer. Andrea couldn't get rid of the feeling that Mrs. Thompson was more than just a special case as she left the room. His words and deeds showed that she had a better grasp of how power works at St. Helena's. Andrea felt a spark of hope for the first time since she started to be there. She had no idea that Mrs. Thompson's arrival would soon set off a chain of events that would shake St. Helena's General Hospital to its core and reveal the deeply rooted biases that lay beneath its perfect exterior. Andrea felt more and more alone as the days went by. What began as mild disinterest from her co-workers had turned into open animosity, with comments whispered and suspicious looks directed at her all the time. Since Dr. Fraser wasn't getting in trouble for his actions, he became more and more brazen in his attempts to hurt her. Andrea was at the nurse's station one morning going through patient charts when Dr. Fraser came up to her with a huge stack of files. He spoke with a voice full of fake concern and told Nurse Davis, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're especially hard. I trust you're up to the task." Andrea looked at the pile and knew right away that it was almost twice as much work as her co-workers. Andrea looked straight into Dr. Fraser's eyes and didn't show any signs of being scared. Her cool answer was, "Of course, Dr. Fraser. I'll take care of it right away." He smiled at the corners of his lips as he walked away, and Andrea heard him say under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." The day was a blur of difficult cases, each one more difficult than the last. Andrea barely had time to catch her breath as she went from one patient to the next. Many of them needed a lot of care or were tough to deal with. Even though her job was growing, she wouldn't lower her standards. She treated every patient with the utmost professionalism. Though, as the hours went by, the constant speed started to make her feel weak in both body and mind. Andrea heard two nurses talking quietly nearby while she was in a hurry to answer another call. One person laughed and said, "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these important cases? It's like they're waiting for her to fail." "I know," he said, "but you have to admit, it's impressive how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." Andrea felt a lot of sadness and anger all at once. The fact that her co-workers knew about the unfair treatment and were closely watching her, waiting for her to trip, hurt. It was almost too much to handle. Andrea felt better when she went to Mrs. Thompson's room during the day. Her room was different from the rest of the hospital. It was a short break where she could catch her breath and feel, if only for a moment, that someone saw how valuable she really was. Nurse Davis, Mrs. Thompson called her during a frequent check. "You look exhausted. Is everything okay?" Andrea forced a weak smile. "Just a busy day, Mrs. Thompson. Nothing I can't handle." Mrs. Thompson looked at her face for a moment, her eyes filled with worry. "You know," she said, "there's a difference between handling something and thriving. From what I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." Even though she said nice things, they only showed how different her behavior was from how the other hospital workers treated her. Andrea could feel a lump forming in her throat. Being alone was making her feel heavy. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said in a voice that was hard to hear. "I appreciate your kindness," she called after her as she turned to leave. "Remember, Nurse Davis," she said in a calm voice, "sometimes the strongest thing you can do is know when to speak up." Andrea left the room, her thoughts running about what she had said. As she walked back to the nurse's station, she had a strong sense that something was about to change. She had no idea that the next day would test her limits and lead to a fight that had been building since her first day at St. Helena's. Andrea went to the hospital the next morning and found it very busy. There were rumors going around that a very important emergency surgery would be happening later that day, and that hospital board members and other important guests would be there to watch. It was clear that everyone in the hospital was nervous as Andrea started her rounds. From nurses to doctors, everyone seemed on edge. The stress of the upcoming surgery was clear in their minds. Dr. Fraser came up to Andrea in the middle of her morning tasks. He had a suspicious look in his eye that made her immediately alert. "Nurse Davis," he said in a calm voice, "we need you to help with the emergency operation this afternoon. A very important case. Are you ready to handle it?" Dr. Fraser asked Andrea, which made her feel both surprised and suspicious. Andrea usually thought it was an honor to be asked to help with such a well-known surgery, but when he asked her, she couldn't help but wonder why he was asking. She answered with a calm voice, "Of course, Dr. Fraser." Before he left, she heard him say to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." He said, "I'll be ready." There was a lot of planning going on in the hours before the surgery. Andrea carefully checked and double-checked everything, wanting to be as ready as she could be for any problems that might arise. As she scrubbed it in, she saw that some of the other staff members were looking at her with doubt. She took a deep breath and remembered what her mother had told her, "Don't you dare let them see you falter." As soon as the surgery started, Andrea was working with Dr. Fraser and other executives. It was clear that there was a lot of stress because important people were watching their every move. In spite of the stress, Andrea stayed focused, and she did what she needed to do quickly and correctly. She showed how experienced she was by giving the surgeons tools before they even asked for them. But as the surgery went on, Andrea noticed something that made her nervous. Dr. Fraser, who was usually calm and sure of himself, seemed to pause. As he got ready to make a very important cut, his hands shook a little. Andrea knew at that very moment that he was going to do something very bad. "Dr. Fraser," she said, her voice steady but calm, "perhaps we should consider a different approach. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." As everyone in the room looked at her, there was silence. Dr. Fraser gave her a look that was both surprised and angry. Andrea thought for a moment that he might just ignore her, but after a short pause, he gave her a small nod and changed how he was talking to her. As the surgery went on, it became clear that her idea had probably saved the patient's life. Andrea could feel everyone in the room looking at her when the surgery was over. Some were looking at her with newfound respect, while others, like Dr. Fraser, were bursting with anger. Dr. Fraser spoke to Andrea in a low, threatening voice as they cleaned up. "Nurse Davis, I need to see you in private now." It was hard for Andrea to breathe as she followed him out of the operating room. Even though she knew it was the right thing to do, she was afraid it would cost her her job. Andrea was shocked when she walked into a private room and saw that it was Mrs. Thompson's room. However, Dr. Fraser didn't seem to notice or care because he was so angry. He came at her from behind, his angry face red. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he yelled, getting angry. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for such insubordination. It didn't matter what Andrea said. She stood her ground. Dr. Fraser, I was doing my job ensuring the patient's safety. His voice was rude as he asked, Your job is to follow orders. Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors, Dr. Fraser said loudly. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like St. Helena's. You're only here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge. Andrea felt a wave of rage and hopelessness as Dr. Fraser's rant became more and more racist and hostile. Every little thing that had happened to her, every microaggression, seemed small in comparison to this obvious act of racism. A voice cut through the tension and stopped Dr. Fraser in the middle of his phrase. Dr. Fraser, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady and with a sense of quiet power. I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to. Dr. Fraser and Andrea both turned around and were shocked to see Mrs. Thompson sitting up in bed with a calm but angry look on her face. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Fraser stuttered, and his face turned pale as he realized how bad his mistake was. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for disturbing you. Oh, I'm fully awake, Dr. Fraser, Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes getting narrow. And I've been awake long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have treated Nurse Davis. Andrea stood still because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The patient, who had been quiet and modest before, now gave off an air of power and authority that filled the room. Dr. Fraser, Mrs. Thompson said next, her voice shaking a little. I assure you, there's been no misunderstanding. It was a sharp cut-off by Mrs. Thompson. There's been no misunderstanding. What I've witnessed here is a clear pattern of discrimination and harassment, and it ends now. She and Dr. Fraser both began to understand that Mrs. Thompson was more than just a special case as she talked. Her strong appearance and authoritative voice showed how powerful she really was. Dr. Fraser slowly lost his confidence and asked, Who are you? Even though Mrs. Thompson smiled, it wasn't warm. Someone with the power to make or break this hospital's future. And right now, Dr. Fraser, I'm not inclined to support an institution that allows blatant racism and unprofessional behavior. As Andrea realized how bad things were, she felt a range of emotions: relief that someone had finally seen and noticed how she was treated, anger at the unfair treatment she had received, and hope that things might finally change. They had no idea that this argument would set off events that would shake St. Helena's to its core, bringing out views that had been hidden for a long time and making them face long overdue truths. Dr. Fraser was having a hard time calming down, and there was a lot of stress in Mrs. Thompson's room. Andrea stood still, her mind still reeling from the quick change of events. Don't you think it's time we had an honest talk about how this hospital works? Mrs. Thompson asked Dr. Fraser with a serious look on her face. A knock at the door cut them off before Dr. Fraser could answer. A nurse who looked tense stuck her head in. Dr. Fraser, the hospital administrator is looking for you. It's urgent. With a torn look, Dr. Fraser looked between Mrs. Thompson and the nurse. He finally gave a stiff nod. We'll talk about this more later, he said as he quickly left the room. She was alone with Mrs. Thompson when the door shut behind her. The silence between them was full of things they didn't say. Nurse Davis, Mrs. Thompson said softly, I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Ruth Thompson, and I'm the CEO of Healthcare Ltd., one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country. Andrea's eyes got really big in shock. Healthcare Ltd. was a huge company in the medical world that was known for having a lot of power and resources. All of a sudden, what Mrs. Thompson had said earlier about being able to make or break the hospital made perfect sense. Andrea began, Mrs. Thompson, double quotes, she didn't know what to say. The woman in the bed next to Mrs. Thompson said, Please sit down. I think we have a lot to discuss. Over the next hour, Mrs. Thompson talked about how her stay at St. Helena's had been unplanned, because of her ice skating accident, but it had shown her how the hospital really felt. As a patient, I came here expecting good medical care, Mrs. Thompson said. Instead, I've witnessed a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that goes against everything I stand for. As a healthcare leader, Mrs. Thompson talked about how she had seen Andrea deal with both overt and covert forms of discrimination, as well as microaggressions, and the hospital's overall toxic culture. Your experience, Nurse Davis, is sadly not unique, Mrs. Thompson said, sounding both angry and determined in her voice. But it is unacceptable, and it stops now. Andrea felt like a weight was lifted off of her as they talked. Since she started at St. Helena's, this was the first time she really felt seen and heard. Mrs. Thompson paid close attention as she talked about what happened, and her face got more serious with each new detail. When she was done, she said, "Thank you for being honest, Nurse Davis. Your strength in facing such adversity is commendable. But now it's time for systemic change, not just individual endurance." At that very moment, the hospital administrator walked in, clearly scared. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand there are concerns about our practices. Please know we take these matters very seriously." Mrs. Thompson stood up and looked at her. "Do you?" "Because from what I've observed, the only thing taken seriously here is protecting an outdated and discriminatory status quo." The administrator was shocked and stuttered. "We have diversity initiatives. Double quotes initiatives are not enough," Mrs. Thompson said next. "What you need is a complete cultural overhaul, starting from the top." Over the next few hours, she laid out his demands: an investigation into all discriminatory practices, diversity training for all staff, a review of the hospital's hiring and promotion policies, and an investigation into Dr. Fraser. Mrs. Thompson said it clearly. His behavior was not only unprofessional, but also dangerous to patient care. The supervisor gave a weak nod when they realized how bad things were. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson, we'll begin implementing these changes immediately." More and more people learned who Mrs. Thompson really was and what changes she wanted to see made as the day went on. People in the hospital were scared, excited, and for some, hopeful. Andrea was the center of attention because she was still thinking about everything. People who had ignored before now came up to her, some awkwardly saying sorry, and others asking for her opinion on the changes that were coming. Andrea went to see Mrs. Thompson one last time at the end of her shift. As she walked in, he smiled warmly. "Nurse Davis, I've recommended you for a position on our newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experience will be invaluable as we work to transform St. Helena's." Andrea thanked her with a lot of feeling in her voice. She was thankful and hopeful. "No, thank you," Mrs. Thompson said. "Your courage and professionalism have been inspiring. You've reminded me why I entered healthcare to make a real difference." Andrea felt like a new era was starting for both herself and St. Helena's as she left the hospital that night. Even though the road ahead would be hard, she felt truly hopeful about the future for the first time. And neither she nor Mrs. Thompson could have imagined how these changes would affect not only St. Helena's, but also the whole healthcare business. The call for change could be heard throughout the whole building. The hospital had lost its once perfect image, which brought to light problems that had been buried for a long time. When Andrea got to the hospital early on Monday morning, it was very busy. Outside, news vans were set up, and reporters were rushing to get statements from anyone who was ready to talk. The staff was huddled together in small groups, whispering nervously, making the room feel tense. Andrea saw Dr. Fraser being led to the administration offices by security as she walked up to the nurses' station. Andrea saw a mix of anger and fear in Dr. Fraser's eyes as they looked at each other for a short time before he was led away. "Andrea," someone said. She turned around and saw Sarah, a nurse who had been rude to her before, coming up to her with an awkward smile. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't mean to," Andrea said. "Thank you," but she didn't know what to say next. As soon as she started to speak, the hospital's public address system went off. All staff members are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. When Andrea got there, the theater was full. As she sat down in the back, she could feel the interested looks and whispers that were following her. In the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson, who was wearing a classy dress even though her arm was in a cast, was having a quiet conversation with the hospital executive and other officials. As the room calmed down, Mrs. Thompson walked up to the platform, which got everyone's attention right away. There was a tense silence after the muttering stopped. "Good morning," she said in a strong, authoritative voice. "For those who don't know me, I am Ruth Thompson, CEO of Healthcare Ltd. Over the past week, I've been a patient here at St. Helena's, recovering from an ice skating accident. During this time, I've had the chance to observe the day-to-day operations and culture of this hospital." She stopped, her eyes sweeping the room. "What I witnessed was deeply troubling. I saw a culture of discrimination, bias, and unprofessional behavior that has no place in modern healthcare." There was a mutter in the crowd. While some staff members moved around in their seats awkwardly, others nodded their heads in agreement. "Let me be clear," Mrs. Thompson said next. "The events I witnessed, particularly the treatment of Nurse Andrea Davis, are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a systemic problem that has been allowed to persist for far too long." Andrea felt the room's eyes turn to hers. She sat up straighter and dealt with the looks of her co-workers with more grace. Mrs. Thompson then talked about the changes that would happen right away. These included a full investigation into unfair practices, diversity and inclusion training for all employees, and a total change to how the hospital hires and promotes people. "Furthermore," she said, his voice hardening, "those found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. Eric Fraser, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct." There was another wave of whispers in the crowd. Andrea saw that some of Dr. Fraser's longtime fans were shocked and angry, while others seemed happy. Mrs. Thompson said, "I know that these changes may be hard for some of you, but let me be clear, this is not just about doing the right thing morally. It's about providing the best possible care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace leads to better outcomes for everyone." Just as Mrs. Thompson was ending her speech, she said something that shocked everyone in the room. "Finally, I'd like to introduce the person who will be in charge of many of these changes. One of the nurses at St. Helena's has decided to become the Chief Diversity Officer. We will learn a lot from her experiences and ideas as we work to change this institution." Andrea felt shocked, proud, and worried all at the same time as the room went wild with cheers. She wasn't ready for this news. She and Mrs. Thompson had only talked about joining the diversity and inclusion group. While she walked toward the front, she saw a range of emotions on the faces of her co-workers, including surprise, respect, and sometimes anger. Andrea took a deep breath at the stage and spoke to the crowd. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. To everyone in this room, I want to say this. I'm not here as an enemy. I'm here as a colleague who believes in the promise of St. Helena's and everyone here. It won't be easy, but I'm committed to working with you all to make the hospital a place where everyone's staff can feel appreciated and every patient, no matter what their background is, gets the best care." Andrea saw the effect of her words as she spoke. Some staff members nodded to show they agreed, while others looked like they were thinking. People who had been rude before seemed to be listening. After the meeting, Andrea was surrounded by co-workers who were congratulating her, saying sorry, and in some cases making tentative moves to make peace. The hospital had a different feel to it now. There was still some tension and doubt, but there was also a new sense of hope and possibility. As the day went on, Andrea worked with Mrs. Thompson and the hospital staff to start making the changes that had been promised. The work was both hard and fun, but Andrea felt like she was really making a difference for the first time since she started at St. Helena's. Andrea was getting ready to leave the hospital that night when she saw Mrs. Thompson waiting for her near the exit. She smiled and said, "Nurse Davis, or should I say Chief Diversity Officer Davis, how are things going?" Andrea was getting ready to leave the hospital that night when she saw Mrs. Thompson waiting for her near the exit. She smiled and said, "Nurse Davis, or should I say Chief Diversity Officer Davis, how are things going?" "It's been a long day, Mrs. Thompson," Andrea said with a small laugh. "To be honest, I'm still thinking about everything," Mrs. Thompson said. "Yes, I understand that this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I have full faith in your ability to make these changes. Your strength and honesty in tough times are exactly what St. Helena's needs right now." She became serious as they walked out the door together. "You should know that what's going on at St. Helena's is just the start. I'm going to make the same changes at all healthcare limited locations." Andrea, your story has the power to change the way we think about diversity and inclusion in healthcare. Andrea felt the weight of the duty fall on her shoulders, but she didn't feel weighed down. Instead, she felt strong. "I'm ready for the test, Mrs. Thompson. We can really make a difference if we work together." Andrea thought about how much had changed in just a few days as they said goodbye. She had been feeling alone and about to give up, but now she was at the head of a movement that could change not only St. Helena's, but also the whole healthcare business. Andrea was feeling very determined, even though the road ahead would be hard and full of problems and people who didn't want change. Now this wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Andrea set out into the evening with a new sense of purpose, ready to face any problems that might come up the next day. St. Helena's was beginning to change, which is the start of a new chapter in the fight for fair and inclusive healthcare. Following Mrs. Thompson's help, St. Helena's General Hospital went through a big change in the months that followed. Andrea, as Chief Diversity Officer, led the change with help from Mrs. Thompson. The society that used to be harmful changed to be more welcoming and respectful. People were against mandatory training in diversity and inclusion at first, but it slowly opened people's thoughts and hearts. Following a thorough review, Dr. Fraser was fired, making it clear that discriminatory behavior would not be accepted in the future. Since people learned about these changes at St. Helena's, Andrea was asked to talk at a lot of medical conferences and diversity seminars. A year after that important day, she spoke to a packed house at a national healthcare meeting. Andrea began, "A year ago, I was a nurse who was about to quit. Today, I stand here as proof that change is possible, that one voice can make a difference." She told St. Helena's story of change, pointing out not only the problems, but also the successes, like how lives were touched, minds were changed, and the culture changed. After the meeting, Mrs. Thompson, who had fully recovered, smiled and walked up to Andrea. She said to her, "Andrea, you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They talked about the progress at St. Helena's and how it would affect the rest of the healthcare business. Mrs. Thompson said that similar programs were being used in a number of hospitals within Healthcare Limited. "Well, Andrea," Mrs. Thompson told her, "when I checked into St. Helena's after my ice skating accident, I had no idea what a journey it would begin. Not only have you changed St. Helena's, but you've also sparked my interest in this work again." Andrea thought about her amazing journey from an unhappy and lonely nurse to a leader and changemaker as she got ready to go back to St. Helena's. She still had a lot of work to do, but she was more driven and hopeful than ever. When Andrea got back to St. Helena's, she was met by Sarah, who used to be a co-worker, but is now a strong ally. The hospital was buzzing with new life, and employees were working together and talking to each other in ways they hadn't done before. Andrea stopped in the main hallway in front of a new mural that showed a diverse group of healthcare workers working together. "Diversity is our strength," it said on a plaque below. "We promise to include everyone. We are called to show compassion." Andrea smiled as she settled into her office. The changes that were made to St. Helena's were just the start. She was ready for the real work of changing hearts, minds, and processes, and she was determined to fight for a healthcare system that really cared for everyone, one day at a time.